Welcome to the SAFECode e-learning course, Authentication 101, Passwords, a backgrounder for software developers. The objectives of this course are to help you become aware of user password handling best practices for your product, learn concrete password complexity checking steps to reduce risk, understand what must be addressed when passwords are stored on a system or transmitted between servers, identify opportunities to make authentication a worthwhile and practical part of your architecture. The primary intended audiences for this course are software architects, developers, quality engineers, and testers. Experienced software designers, development managers, and product managers seeking a basic understanding of password handling complexity will also benefit from this material. We'll begin by explaining the difference between authentication and authorization, and why these two things should never be mixed. Before discussing the why behind password requirements, we'll review some key definitions of which you'll need to be aware. This will continue into the handling of unsuccessful logon attempts, password hashing and encryption, and lastly, password recovery. Authentication is the act of confirming that you are who you say you are. For example, my driver's license authenticates who I am. Login credentials are supposed to authenticate based on the idea that only the user knows a secret, for example, their password. My birth certificate authenticates that I was born in this country. However, it does so without actually authorizing me to do anything. Authorization deals with the basic question of what am I allowed to do? There are many examples of authentication linking directly to authorization. My driver's license authenticates my identity, but also authorizes me to drive and establishes the boundaries on that driving. For example, I'm not permitted to drive without wearing corrective eyeglasses. A subway token is another example. It is a completely non-identifying or non-authenticating token, yet it authorizes you to ride a subway. The scope of authentication is easiest to illustrate in human terms, but there are non-human examples too. Systems authenticate to each other, processes on the system authenticate to each other, and so on. We'll now clarify some common terms used in discussions about authentication and authorization. These terms are typically used in a user account context. First, we must clearly understand the difference between user identification and user authentication. During the logon process to a system, the user enters their username for identification. To authenticate their username, the user enters their password. Authentication would also be possible through other means such as smart cards, encryption tokens, or biometrics. Authentication is usually performed once per login session, with the user remaining authenticated until they end the session by logging off. Authorization deals with whether or not to permit an authenticated user to perform a specific action. Authorization parameters are set as user access rights and stored within the system via defined user groups or profiles. User access rights grant user accounts authorization via assignment to these user groups or profiles. Attempted user tasks initiate authorization checks, which verify that the user has the required access rights to perform that task. In the coming slides, we'll discuss passwords and how to make the best password implementation possible. It's important to point out that even when using the best possible password implementation, we're still only on the first rung of the authentication security ladder. Passwords, regardless of the implementation, are still passwords, and stronger forms of authentication are available. Let's discuss user authentication factors, of which there are three forms. The something you know. This is a secret such as a password or a PIN number. The something you have, such as a physical token or security card. And lastly, the something you are. This is a unique biometric user characteristic, such as a fingerprint or retina. You'll often hear the expressions strong authentication or two-factor authentication in this context. This means that two of these three factors are used for authentication, for example, using a badge plus a PIN number. As an alternative to password authentication, strong authentication can increase both the security and usability of your site. So why are we focusing on passwords in this course? The answer is, passwords are the de facto standard and interoperate with everything. When reflecting on secure and insecure password implementations, you can trace their differences back to how we think about the requirements themselves. Passwords are such a pervasive part of our lives these days, it's easy to take them for granted. We often use passwords for no other reason than other systems use them as well. It's easy to fall into the mindset that password implementation is a checkbox item. You implement a password, meet the requirements, then move on to the parts of an application you're actually interested in building. By digging into the requirement behind passwords, keeping unauthenticated users out of your users' accounts, the true motivation becomes clear. Successful password implementation requires doing whatever it takes to keep today's motivated, sophisticated attackers out of your users' accounts. Users do not want their accounts compromised and data stolen, so it's in their best interest that you keep these attackers out. It's also in your best interest and your company's as a whole, because when a customer's account is compromised, it necessitates an incident response and more work is created for everyone. It can also damage your company's brand, so it's worth the time and effort to implement passwords correctly up front. Password rules depend on you doing everything possible to keep attackers out, and the values themselves are dynamic. They're pegged to ever-changing customer demands for security and privacy. Attackers' levels of sophistication are also rising, with Moore's Law allowing them faster computers and more bandwidth with which to perform their attacks. At the same time, your company's own notion of acceptable risk continues to change. For example, with an expanding customer base and a more widely recognized brand, the desire to protect hard-won customer assets and market reputation increases. Acceptable risk levels tend to lower over time for a given product, and being proactive saves you work. You could work towards implementing the absolute minimum level of password security for your system, but that almost guarantees you'll need to revisit that portion of your application again in the near future as these dynamic values change. It will save time and effort to implement strong password security from the beginning, which you may not need to revisit for several years. Currently, we think of strong passwords as those containing at least 8 mixed case characters, numbers, and symbols. While you may argue that your specific application doesn't require that level of security today, it may need it in the near future. So it's a good minimum standard target. Implementing an 8-character requirement uses the same level of effort as a 7-character system, and the additional effort needed to implement a mixed case system is negligible. Therefore, with the same effective amount of work at the beginning, you can avoid the need to revisit your password implementation down the road. You can also mitigate the threats with slowdown or account lockout strategies, but it's important to understand that they are insufficient on their own. Password complexity is a necessary ingredient in the security of your application. As an example of why it's important to use strong password security implementations, consider this. If an attacker knows that an application accepts very simple passwords, they may use a common password like secret and attempt a brute force attack trying that one password against all possible usernames. On systems that allow weak passwords, this would likely grant the attacker access to a significant number of user accounts. When asked to implement strong password requirements, developers often voice usability concerns. However, these arguments have begun to fade with time. Browsers, operating systems, and other client programs now offer options to save passwords, so the common complaints about memorization and input difficulty are now much harder to validate. Users who don't use password storage functions often reuse passwords across multiple websites. So it's a matter of security orthodoxy that we aren't in a position to enforce and begin addressing usability issues. The argument that complex passwords are hard to memorize is far less persuasive when it's known that users are typing them in multiple times per day. There's also an emerging consensus among notable security experts such as Whitfield Diffie and Bruce Schneier that users should simply write their passwords down. Storing a password in your wallet is more secure than storing it on your computer or mobile device. Ultimately, if complicated password usability is still a concern, backing down the ladder towards weaker security is not the solution. If you want greater usability without the complications of complex passwords, move up the ladder to stronger methods, such as two-factor authentication. Now that we've established what strong passwords are, let's talk about where to enforce that strength requirement. You should enforce strong password creation at the time of account creation, when a user initially selects their password, and later when a user changes their password. It's worth noting that there are applications implementing APIs that accept a hash of the password over the wire rather than the password itself. If you have such an application, then your server is not enforcing password strength. This is due to the application receiving a hash instead of the original text, so it has no basis from which to evaluate the password strength. We'll provide another example of why we discourage sending hashes over the wire later. Passwords should never be hard-coded, meaning the password must be changeable by users. Wherever authentication passwords are used, assign an initial value and force users to change it upon their first login. Passwords should never be cached in RAM without adequate protection. In the case of a system outage, the password would be easily accessible in clear text within the post-mortem dump. Libraries such as libcrack or cracklib can help you implement password strength enforcement. Let's talk about some other common password enforcement practices. You should avoid allowing password reuse, where users use the same password during a password change or reset. This requires checking their password history and forcing the user to select another password if they attempt to input a previously used value. You should also force users to update their passwords after a set length of time. Good practice for the password aging time is 90 days, but this depends on the criticality of a system. This periodic password change should be system enforced. Password masking should be implemented to hide the password text as it's being entered to deter over-the-shoulder password theft. Implementing a dictionary check to disallow using common dictionary words as passwords is recommended. Password rules, also called password complexity, should be configurable by a system administrator depending on the criticality of a system. System administrators should be able to set minimum password character lengths, acceptable characters, and aging time. Display password rules on the screen if a password has been entered which doesn't conform to the password complexity rules. More details about password rules can be found in standards like ISO 27002, the payment card industry, or PCI, and others. Let's talk about what the user experience should look like for an unsuccessful logon attempt. When users select strong passwords, attackers face a high probability of logging many unsuccessful logon attempts on the account they're trying to attack. You should consider the information leaked to an attacker when using specific messages in response to an unsuccessful logon attempt. Phrases such as "no such username" or "bad password for that username" can provide attackers with clues on what course of action they should attempt next. For example, you attempt to use the same bad username or password error message for both the password and username upon a bad logon attempt. A typographical error throws the messages out of sync, with the intended username error message displaying an extra white space or character. Attackers will notice this slight difference between the two error messages, and from them will be able to determine which attempted entry was in fact correct. This knowledge has now enabled them to focus their efforts on the incorrect entry, increasing their chance of success. To avoid this pitfall, the error messages should be consistent to avoid aiding an attacker. Experienced designers can help you create a message that works best for your application and its users. Another unsuccessful logon attempt aspect is whether to implement a slowdown or account lockout behavior as an active response to successive unsuccessful logon attempts. We'll first discuss user account locking. 3 strikes and you're locked out policies can prevent a user account from being compromised, but they have their own drawbacks and disadvantages. For instance, attackers do not care if they lock out a legitimate user of their account, and may even seek to do so intentionally. They could conceivably lock out every user on the system or lead to a denial of service attack on the entire site. Another drawback is the increased need for customer phone or email support to deal with customers who, more often than not, accidentally locked their own accounts. A stronger, more flexible approach is to set up progressively increased slowdowns for each unsuccessful logon attempt. There may be no delay until the second failed attempt, at which point the delay time increases between each successive attempt. This method, while effective, does carry a higher degree of complexity. To implement this method effectively, you would need to synchronize it across application server nodes. Otherwise, an attacker could burn up their one failed login or one app server node. then switch to another app server or application. This is difficult to implement within the current web service infrastructure. It's also worth pointing out that this method is also subject to abuse should the delays be set without an upper bound. Attackers abusing geometrically increasing unbound delays can effectively lock many users out of their accounts for long periods. A good cost to performance compromise is to implement fixed slowdowns against failed logon attempts. While implementing fixed slowdowns for failed logon attempts can discourage brute force attacks, there are some pitfalls to avoid. The most common implementation is to display a logon failed message while running a retry delay. An attacker attempting to brute force usernames and passwords may just take a break and attempt to log in again early, so that 5-second delay won't necessarily hurt the attacker. However, forcing a wait between login attempts can negatively affect a legitimate user's experience. There's a more advanced implementation to consider, which focuses the impact of the delay on an attacker and makes the delay largely invisible to legitimate users. The implementation requires the server to respond to a failed login attempt with a message and to timestamp the failed attempt. Alternatively, the server can add a predetermined amount of time to that timestamp. A legitimate user will typically spend a few seconds reading the failed login message, checking their caps lock key, etc., before reattempting a login. An attacker, on the other hand, will likely make a second attempt immediately. The server should check the initial bad login attempt timestamp and sleep any remaining delay time without even considering whether the next login attempt is correct or not. In practice, a legitimate user is unlikely to have any delay time left to sleep, or this small amount of time will not significantly affect their experience. However, for attackers reattempting many logins quickly, the system enforces and compounds the delay for each successive attempt. By combining fixed slowdowns with strong password complexity rules, brute force attacks will be less feasible. We've suggested some basic automated mitigation, such as strong password enforcement and slowdowns. But humans, such as Network Operations Center personnel, should play an active role in mitigation as well. While it could be fun to try developing an equivalent to the fictional self-defending, artificially intelligent, fully automated Skynet, this is not an efficient use of effort in practice. Provide audit trails of both successful and unsuccessful log-on attempt activity to your Network Operations Center, where active human monitoring can bolster the automated security of your application. If they notice that many failed login attempts are originating from a certain IP address range, they can decide to block that range temporarily or take other action. Automated systems are always at risk of being fooled, so human decision-making is essential to the effective deployment of more advanced countermeasures. We'll now discuss the common methods used to address password storage security. Passwords can be stored as clear text, a loosely obfuscated equivalent, or symmetrically encrypted with an algorithm such as AES. They can also be stored using a one-way method as an undecryptable hash. Before implementing a password storage scheme, check that it is compliant with your organization's password storage policy. Your organization might use a standardized hash or encryption algorithm implementation. You may also need to consider ISO 27002 and PSI standard compliance. First, we'll discuss clear text, obfuscated text, and symmetrically encrypted text. And these types of password storage should never be used in a user account or system account setting. In server systems, secure password storage is an essential line of defense against data theft. If attackers compromise the system, they would not be able to access securely stored passwords, eliminating the need for all users to change their password after a system break-in. However, a compromised system storing passwords in clear text or a symmetrically decryptable form is an absolute worst-case scenario. An attacker can easily read clear text, and with encryptions such as AES, they can steal the decryption key stored on the server. There are no good reasons to use either of these schemes. We do not recommend implementing these types of password storage schemes. They are wide open to an attacker that has gained a foothold and can make dealing with your customers an embarrassing experience in the aftermath of a break-in. Secure password storage is difficult to implement properly and beyond the scope of an introductory course like this. In fact, this is something that many get wrong on their first attempt. Thankfully, there are standards you can and should leverage, as outlined on the slide. It's notable that there are libraries available that implement these standards in nearly every programming language. We've now covered protecting passwords at the time of their creation and in storage. So let's talk about protecting passwords while in transport. We recommend using SSL, HTTPS, to protect passwords and other sensitive data when transferred over the wire. Developers often try to avoid what they perceive as the performance or expense of SSL by instituting their own lightweight versions of SSL. These custom cryptos often leave out checks against attacks that SSL would normally recognize and stop. So while possibly faster, they are certain to be less secure. For example, lighter weight SSLs commonly fail against attacks using an active man-in-the-middle altering data on the fly. SSL is on revision 3 for a reason. Many communities and individuals have extensively reviewed and tested SSL, and we strongly recommend using it rather than your own custom in-house library. Further supporting this recommendation is the recent quieting of performance and expense arguments against SSL. With risk tolerance declining and security requirements trending upward, SSL cost justifies itself. Crypto accelerators and dedicated SSL offload boxes are available for high-volume applications, effectively making it free on your application stack. The value of a sustainable long-term architecture is apparent. However, product managers must balance short-term and long-term needs. They must consider where to invest in sustainable long-term architecture versus cutting corners to hit short-term deadlines and revenue goals. Using SSL is one of those balancing opportunities. Password recovery is an important, necessary feature. However, poor password recovery implementations provide a convenient attack surface for malicious users. Some of the most commonly used password recovery implementations are the resetting of the password if the username is known, security questions that must be answered correctly to retrieve the current password, the transmission of an existing or new password, or password reset token via email. We do not recommend using any implementation that allows retrieval of an existing password or transmits a new password. Implementations that set a new password after a user meets certain criteria or conditions offer better security. A more robust methodology to react to forgotten passwords would be to validate the user based on certain identification characteristics. This could be application or user specific. For example, first and last name, address, email address, or first pet name. It is worth noting that this data should never rely or ask the user for data that introduces greater risk than the lost password. For example, date of birth and social security number allow for identity theft in the real world versus simply exposing the data or activity on your particular application. Your system should never introduce greater exposure for the user than what they do in your system, if at all possible. Verify the answers to the security questions set up during the account creation process. Send a time-stamped password reset token to a user-controlled email address acquired during account setup. The password reset token should be rendered void after use, or if unused after the associated timestamp expires. Password reset mechanisms can be triggered manually by the system administrator or automatically by a special password reset process. After meeting all the criteria, force the user to change their password. Let's discuss some additional considerations requiring examination in the context of authentication and passwords. Architecturally, you should implement authentication within a single module or entity. You must call this module or entity wherever using authentication is required. However, a more comprehensive solution is using an external authentication server with an enterprise-wide single point of authentication as its main advantage. The authentication server decides whether to allow or deny users attempting to access a system or application. Default password handling with the customer is another consideration, especially within the documentation and manuals provided to the customer to operate the system. System documentation, installation guides in particular, should clearly identify for which accounts default passwords are set. Clearly describe the process by which a user can change the default password, with extra emphasis that the user should change the default password. An ideal implementation would force system administrators to change default passwords during installation via an installation script or procedure. Let's summarize what we've learned during this course. Authentication and authorization are completely different concepts, and there is substantial value in implementing strong and abstract authentication architecture in your application. The factors that drive the evolving upward trend towards stronger password security requirements are dynamic. 8-character mixed-case complex passwords are the minimum requirement for today's market. Unsuccessful logon attempts should be handled with delays and nonspecific error messages, and sophisticated approaches toward user account locking are desirable to maintain a high level of usability for your customers. Robust automated security logic can stop many types of attacks, but any automated system is fallible. Stopping highly coordinated attacks requires Network Operating Center personnel intervention, and you can assist them by providing the audit trails they need. You should plan to implement or migrate to secure password storage using salted SHA-256-based hashing algorithms, and you should use the established SSL library to secure password transmission. We should remember that passwords are only on the first rung of the ladder in terms of authentication security. For critical systems, you should look to move upward towards two-factor authentication, which is today's state-of-the-art technology.